What would you do if everything you owned could be held in one hand, and it was only worth $3? For a young woman in the Wyoming Territory of the 1870s, that wasn't a question. It was the sharp-edged truth of a Tuesday morning. She traded those $3 for a thing no one else wanted. The splintered, forgotten wreck of a mail coach, left for dead in a ditch. Everyone in the small town of Redemption Creek laughed at her for it. But the truth waiting inside its broken frame was a secret that could save a fort, expose a traitor, and prove that the most dismissed things and people often hold the most value. Settle in and let us know where you're watching from as we tell the story of Margaret Voss and the coach that changed everything. The dust of Redemption Creek tasted like failure. Margaret Voss felt it coat her tongue, a fine grit that settled in the back of her throat, a constant reminder of the dry well her life had become. She had walked the last 10 miles, the worn soles of her boots whispering against the packed earth of the road leading into town. She carried no bag, no satchel, nothing but the clothes she wore, and a weight in her heart that felt heavier than any trunk. 2 days ago, she'd been a laundress at Fort Laramie, her hands perpetually raw from lye soap and hot water, but her small room had been her own, her work honest. Then the captain's wife had misplaced a lace collar, and a swift, sharp finger of blame had pointed directly at Margaret. No proof, just suspicion. It was enough. Dismissed, cast out with a day's wages, and a reputation smudged like soot. Now she stood at the edge of the town's dusty main street, a lone figure against the vast, indifferent blue of the Wyoming sky. Redemption Creek was a place you passed through on your way to somewhere else. A handful of weathered buildings clinging to the banks of a shallow, muddy river. A saloon, a general store, a livery, and a blacksmith's shop made up its heart. Today, that heart was gathered in a small, noisy crowd near the livery stable. A county auction was underway. It was a spectacle of other people's lives, a farmer's plow, a widow's rocking chair, a set of chipped porcelain dishes. Margaret drifted toward the gathering, drawn not by hope, but by the simple human need to be near other people, even if she was invisible to them. She clutched the 3 silver dollars in her pocket, the sum total of her worldly wealth. It was not enough for a meal and a room for the night, not enough for a horse, not enough for a ticket on a stagecoach heading anywhere. It was just enough to mock her. She remembered her father, a carpenter with hands that could read the soul of a piece of wood. He'd taught her that a thing's true worth wasn't in its polish, but in its grain, in the strength of its core. He was gone now, taken by a fever 3 winters past, and his wisdom felt like a story from another lifetime. Standing in that crowd, Margaret felt she had no grain, no core. She was just polish, worn away to nothing. The auctioneer, a man with a booming voice and a sweat-stained hat, was trying to sell a stack of rusted branding irons. Margaret leaned against a post of the livery's awning, the rough wood a small comfort against her back. Her gaze drifted past the crowd, past the town, to the open country beyond. It was a land of stark beauty and brutal honesty. It didn't care if you were rich or poor, innocent or guilty. It only cared if you were strong enough to endure. She wasn't sure she was. Her strength had been leached out of her, drip, by hard work, by loneliness, by the final, stinging injustice of her dismissal. The auctioneer's voice cut through her thoughts, loud and dismissive. "All right, folks, last item of the day, and it ain't much. Dragged it up from the bottom of Willow Creek Ravine last week. A genuine U.S. mail coach, or what's left of her." He gestured with a theatrical flourish, and the crowd parted, revealing the object of his scorn. It lay on its side on a heavy-duty wagon, a carcass of wood and iron, a monument to disaster. One side was caved in, the bright red paint splintered and scarred, the proud gold lettering spelling U.S. Mail fractured and barely legible. One wheel was missing entirely, the axle a jagged spear of broken wood. It looked like the skeleton of some great beast that had died a violent death. Laughter rippled through the crowd. The coach was a ruin. It sat there under the high, unforgiving sun, a testament to some forgotten tragedy. The auctioneer wiped his brow and continued his patter. Now, the army's already written it off. Said it ain't worth salvaging. But for the enterprising man, there's good scrap iron in the fittings. And the wood, well, it'll burn hot this winter. He winked. Who'll start the bidding for this pile of kindling? $5? Do I hear 5 for a winter's worth of firewood? Silence. The crowd just shuffled and grinned. A big barrel-chested man with a florid face and a superior smirk, a man Margaret would later learn was named Silas Croft, let out a loud guffaw. You'd have to pay me to haul that trash away, Miller, he boomed, and the crowd laughed with him. The auctioneer's face soured. Fine, $1? Who'll give me $1 for the scrap? More silence. Margaret looked at the coach. She saw the splintered wood, the broken wheel, the shredded leather of the driver's box. But she also saw something else. She saw a wall, a roof, a shield against the wind that was already starting to carry the first bite of autumn. She saw shelter. Her father had taught her how to mend things, how to see the use in what others threw away. A desperate, foolish idea took root in her mind. It was a wild, grasping hope, but it was the only hope she had. She took a deep breath, the dust of failure still in her throat, and pushed her way through the amused onlookers. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the murmuring. $3, she said. The auctioneer stared. The crowd went silent, then erupted in a wave of disbelief and derision. Silas Croft turned to look at her, his eyes sweeping over her worn dress, her dusty boots. He laughed, a deep, cruel sound. The girl's bought herself a woodpile. He bellowed. The auctioneer, eager to be done, slammed his gavel down. Sold. To the young lady for $3. Margaret walked forward, her face a pale mask, and placed her entire fortune in his outstretched hand. She now owned the wreck. What could a lone woman with no resources possibly do with a shattered coach? Was it a foolish grasp at survival, or did she see something that everyone else had missed? Let us know what you think she should do next in the comments below, and if you haven't already, please subscribe for more stories of the resilient human spirit. Now back to Margaret, as she stands alone with her impossible $3 purchase. The laughter followed her like a swarm of biting flies. As the crowd dispersed, shaking their heads and muttering about fools and their money, Margaret was left alone with the monument to her folly. It loomed over her, larger and more broken than it had seemed from a distance. Silas Croft, the man whose laughter had been the loudest, strode over to her, his heavy boots kicking up puffs of dust. He ran a proprietary hand over the splintered wood, his expression one of contemptuous pity. $3, girl? He said, his voice dripping with condescension. For a pile of splinters? You've got more coin than sense. He leaned in, his bulk blocking the sun. Tell you what, I feel sorry for you. I'll give you $1 for it. Take the iron for my freight wagons. You can walk away with something in your pocket. He saw her as a simpleton, an object of sport. Margaret looked from his fleshy, confident face to the wrecked coach. She thought of her father's hands, calloused and sure, planing a piece of rough-sawn pine into something smooth and true. She met Croft's gaze, her own clear and steady. No, she said. The single word, spoken without heat or anger, hung in the air. Croft's face tightened. He wasn't used to being refused, especially not by someone like her. Suit yourself, he sneered. Enjoy your firewood. He turned and walked away, his back rigid with indignation. Margaret was left in the quiet aftermath of the auction, the silence almost as loud as the laughter had been. She stood there for a long time, simply looking. She didn't know what to do next. She owned it, but it was on a wagon in the middle of town. She had no land, no mule to drag it. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting long shadows that made the coach look even more skeletal, an old woman wrapped in a colorful trade blanket shuffled past. She was Shoshone, her face a beautiful, intricate map of wrinkles, her black eyes holding a deep, ancient stillness. She stopped and looked not at Margaret, but at the coach. Her gaze was intense, as if she were reading a story written in the broken wood. She ran a gnarled hand over a deep gouge in the side panel, her touch surprisingly gentle. Then, her eyes met Margaret's. She spoke, her voice a low, gravelly whisper, her English heavily accented but clear. "Some wood remembers the way," she said. She held Margaret's gaze for a moment longer, a look of profound, unspoken meaning passing between them. Then, without another word, she continued on her way, disappearing around the corner of the general store. Margaret was left with the cryptic phrase echoing in her mind. It made no sense, yet it felt like a key, or a blessing. A few minutes later, the liveryman, a stooped, kindly man named Jed, emerged from his stable. He'd watched the whole exchange. "That was foolish, miss," he said, not unkindly. "But I've done foolish things for pride myself." He looked at her, then at the coach. He sighed, a sound of weary resignation. "Got a patch of land out past the creek," he said, gesturing with his thumb. "Scrub and rock, mostly, nobody's claimed it. If you can get that thing there, it's yours to squat on." For a while, anyway, he saw the question in her eyes. "I got an old mule and a stone boat. Ain't fast, but it's strong. Be my charity for the day." Margaret felt a prickling behind her eyes, the first stirrings of an emotion she hadn't allowed herself to feel. "Gratitude, thank you," she whispered. Jed just nodded, already turning to fetch the mule. He was the only person in Redemption Creek who hadn't laughed. And for that, Margaret would never forget him. The journey was a slow, grinding ordeal. Jed's mule, aptly named Cinder, was old and stubborn, but possessed a deep geologic strength. With a series of chains and levers, they managed to coax the heavy, ruined body of the coach off the wagon and onto the stone boat, a low-slung sled used for hauling rocks from fields. The sound of the wreckage scraping onto the sled was a shriek of tortured metal and splintering wood. It felt like a violation. Once it was settled, the real work began. Jed led the mule, and Margaret walked alongside the sled, pushing when it bogged down, placing rocks under the runners to get over ruts. They moved at a crawl, a strange funereal procession leaving the town behind. The sun was a merciless hammer in the sky. Sweat soaked the back of Margaret's dress, and her hands were raw from gripping the rough wood. They passed the last of the town's outbuildings, the church with its lonely steeple, and ventured onto a rough track that led toward the creek. The land here was marginal, unwanted. The soil was thin, littered with rocks, and dotted with sagebrush and hardy, twisted pines. This was the land of the forgotten, a fitting resting place for her purchase. By the time they reached the small, flat parcel Jed had described, the sun was a fiery orange smear on the western horizon. The plot was, as he'd said, mostly rock and scrub, with a single, wind-bent cottonwood tree standing sentinel. It wasn't much, but it was flat, and it was hers, for now. With one last great effort, they maneuvered the coach off the stone boat and onto the ground. It settled with a deep groan, a final sigh of exhaustion. It looked even worse here, a man-made wound on the face of the landscape. Jed unhitched Cinder and gave the mule a fond pat. He handed Margaret a full canteen. "Water from my well," he said. "It's sweet." He looked at her, his face etched with concern in the fading light. "You sure about this, miss?" Margaret looked at the wreck, her wreck. "I have to be," she replied. Jed nodded slowly. He didn't understand, but he seemed to respect her resolve. "Be careful," he said, and with that, he and Cinder turned and headed back toward the distant lights of the town, leaving Margaret utterly alone. The silence that descended was absolute, broken only by the whisper of the wind through the sagebrush. As twilight deepened into night, a profound sense of desolation washed over her. The coach was no longer a symbol of hope. It was a coffin. The dark stain on the floorboards that she'd noticed earlier seemed blacker now, more sinister. She couldn't bring herself to go inside. Instead, she huddled against one of the intact wheels, pulling her thin shawl tight around her shoulders. The wood was cold, and the wind whistled a mournful tune through the shattered windows. A coyote howled in the distance, a sound of pure, unbridled loneliness. Margaret closed her eyes, the $3 a phantom weight in her memory, and spent her first night as a property owner, sleeping on the ground beside her ruin. The first light of dawn was pale and thin, the color of watery milk. Margaret woke stiff and cold, her back aching from the hard ground. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. Then her eyes fell on the coach, and the reality of her situation settled back onto her like a shroud. It was a grim sight in the morning light. The dew had settled on the splintered wood, making it look dark and rotten. The shredded remains of the leather upholstery hung in sad, limp strips. It smelled of damp, decay, and something else, something metallic and vaguely unsettling. A wave of despair, sharp and nauseating, rose in her throat. Silas Croft's mocking laughter echoed in her ears. Firewood, maybe he was right, maybe she was a fool. But her father's voice, a faint memory from a distant, happier time, whispered back. Start with what you can fix, Maggie, one board at a time. Clinging to that thought, she stood up and began to work. Her first task was simply to clean. She wasn't looking for anything, she was just imposing a small measure of order on the chaos. She pulled out handfuls of stuffing from the ripped seats, the horsehair damp and musty. She swept out broken glass from the lamps and windows with a makeshift broom of sagebrush. As the sun climbed higher, warming her back, she began to feel a rhythm to the work. It was mindless, physical labor, and it quieted the frantic voices in her head. She was working on the interior of the passenger cabin, a space no bigger than a closet, when her hand brushed against something. She was clearing away a long, torn strip of the plush velvet wall covering, revealing the wooden paneling beneath. Her fingers, their tips still sensitive despite the calluses from years of laundry work, snagged on a line of small, metal bumps. She looked closer. It was a row of brass tacks, the kind used in fine upholstery, hammered flush into the dark wood. They were tarnished and nearly invisible against the grain. At first, she thought it was just a decorative border. But as she peeled back more of the velvet, she saw that the pattern was strange. It wasn't a straight line, nor a repeating curve. It meandered, stopped, and started again, a series of short, straight lines at odd angles. It looked like a mistake, a child's careless scribbling. Her father had been a master cabinet maker before he'd turned to rougher carpentry, and he had taught her to appreciate the logic of construction. Every joint, every brace, every nail had a purpose. A good craftsman wasted nothing, not a single movement, not a single nail. This pattern felt wasteful, illogical, and that bothered her. She ran her finger along the tacks. They were smooth, worn. She traced the path, her brow furrowed. It felt intentional. It felt like a code or a map, but of what? It was just a detail, a small, insignificant anomaly in a mountain of wreckage. She had more pressing concerns: finding water, finding food, reinforcing a section of the roof before the next rain. She dismissed the thought and went back to her cleaning. But the image of the strange, broken line of tacks remained, a splinter lodged in the back of her mind. Something about the wood was trying to speak, and she didn't yet know the language. Days bled into one another, marked by the slow passage of the sun across the sky. Margaret's life settled into a Spartan routine: rise at dawn, work on the coach, forage for edible roots and berries, and huddle in her makeshift shelter at night. The wreck was slowly transforming. Using a small, dull hatchet she'd found rusted in the coach's toolbox, she painstakingly cut and trimmed the salvaged planks, fashioning a small, relatively watertight room within the larger ruin. She used strips of torn canvas from the roof to patch the walls, creating a space that was dark and cramped, but offered a real defense against the wind. One evening, A creature limped into the small circle of light cast by her fire. It was a dog, a scruffy yellow mutt with one ear torn and a useless back leg that it dragged behind it. It was starved thin, its ribs a washboard beneath its matted coat. It stopped just outside the firelight, its one good eye watching her with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. Margaret, whose own hunger was a constant, dull ache, looked at the half-roasted prairie turnip she had on a stick over the flames. She broke off a piece and tossed it to the dog. It snatched it up greedily. From that moment on, he was her shadow, a silent, three-legged companion she named Trip. With Trip sleeping at her feet, the nights were less lonely. And with the dog as her audience, she found herself talking aloud as she worked, narrating her tasks. "Now, if I can just get this brace to hold," she'd mutter, wrestling with a warped piece of wood. The physical labor was a balm. Her hands, once soft from the constant immersion in water, grew tough and calloused. She learned the coach not with her eyes, but with her hands. She felt the subtle differences in the wood, the hard, unyielding oak of the frame, the softer, more pliable pine of the paneling. She learned the unique groan of each joint, the specific catch of a rusted hinge. The coach was no longer just an object. It was a partner in her survival. One afternoon, a fierce gust of wind rattled a loose interior panel, the one behind which she'd first seen the strange pattern of tacks. The noise was maddening, a constant thump-thump-thump against the main frame. She decided to fix it once and for all. As she examined the panel, her eyes were drawn again to that illogical line of brass tacks. She traced it with a grimy finger. Some wood remembers the way. The old woman's words came back to her. Unbidden, she thought of the puzzle boxes her father used to make, little wooden marvels with hidden buttons and secret sequences. On a whim, she pressed one of the tacks. Nothing happened. She pressed another, and another. She tried to find a logic, a pattern. She followed the strange, broken line, pressing each tack in the order it appeared. The last tack was near the floor, almost hidden by a shadow. She pressed it firmly. Instead of the solid resistance of wood, she felt a slight give and heard a soft, satisfying click. The sound was almost inaudible, but in the prairie silence, it was as loud as a gunshot. She stared at the panel. It hadn't been warped. It had been set. The entire panel had shifted, just a fraction of an inch, revealing a clean, dark line where there should have been none. It wasn't a panel. It was a door. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She worked her fingernails into the thin crack the click had revealed and pulled. The small door, no bigger than a book, swung inward on silent, well-oiled hinges. It opened into a dark, narrow cavity. For a moment, Margaret was afraid to look, afraid of what she might find, or of finding nothing at all. But curiosity, and a sense that she was on the cusp of understanding, was stronger than her fear. She reached inside. Her fingers brushed against cool, smooth leather. With a trembling hand, she drew the object out into the light. It was a leather satchel, thick and sturdy, the flap embossed with the official eagle insignia of the United States Army. It was a mail pouch, not the large public sacks, but a private one, for sensitive documents. The leather was stiff, and a dark, ominous stain marred one corner, but the brass buckle was still secure. Her hands shook so badly she could barely work the clasp. When it finally gave way, she lifted the flap. Inside, nestled in the tin-lined compartment designed to keep the contents dry, was a stack of folded papers, tied with a length of twine. The top document was a dispatch, its official script stark against the creamy paper. Beneath the stack of papers, something else lay flat against the bottom. She gently lifted the dispatches and drew it out. It was a map, folded into a neat square. As she unfolded it, her breath caught in her throat. The map was of the Wyoming Territory, detailing the trails and supply routes between the major forts. But it was the large, dark brown stain that covered a third of it that made her stomach clench. It was stiff, and it flaked at the edges as she opened it. It was blood. a lot of it. She carefully spread the map on the floor of the coach. It showed the main route from Fort Fetterman east to Fort Laramie. But there were other marks, made in pencil. Known safe passages were crossed out. Small, insignificant canyons were circled. A new, treacherous path was sketched in, a detour that led through a notorious stretch of badlands. It made no sense. This wasn't a route a mail carrier would ever take. Her eyes fell back to the stack of dispatches. She untied the twine and picked up the top one. It was addressed to the commanding officer at Fort Laramie. The date was over a month ago. The script was hurried, urgent. "Sir," it began, "I have confirmed the rumors. Red Cloud's warriors are not the primary threat. A large party of renegade sellers, supplied by a civilian freight contractor, is gathering in the Antelope Hills. They intend to raid the northern supply lines before winter. They are well armed with new rifles. We are outnumbered. Send reinforcements to the Willow Creek crossing at once. The bearer of this dispatch, Corporal Evans, knows the location. Trust no one else." It was signed by a scout Margaret had heard of, a man named Boone Mercer. She read the words again. The Willow Creek crossing. That was the ravine where the coach had been found. Corporal Evans had never made it. The wreck wasn't an accident. It was an ambush, designed to silence a warning. The blood on the map belonged to the messenger. And the secret he died to protect was now in her hands. A low, gray bank of clouds was massing on the western horizon, mirroring the cold dread that was spreading through Margaret's chest. The dispatch felt heavy in her hand, a weight of responsibility she had not asked for. The fort had to be warned. This information was a month old. Whatever was planned could happen at any moment. She had to get this to Fort Laramie. She quickly gathered the dispatches and the map, tucking them back into the leather satchel. She would leave at first light. As she was securing the flap, the sound of a horse's labored breathing made her freeze. Tripp let out a low growl, the fur on his neck bristling. Margaret peered through a crack in the coach wall. A lone rider was approaching, slumped low over his horse's neck. The horse was stumbling, exhausted. As they drew closer, she saw the dark stain on the rider's shoulder and the arrow shaft protruding from it. The man was a fort scout. She recognized the buckskin jacket and the army issue horse. He was barely conscious. He finally slid from the saddle, collapsing in a heap just yards from her shelter. Margaret didn't hesitate. She rushed out, Tripp limping anxiously behind her. The scout was muttering, his eyes glazed with fever. It was Boone Mercer, the man who had signed the dispatch. He must have been on patrol, looking for his missing partner, Corporal Evans. "Tracked. They tracked me," he whispered, before his eyes rolled back in his head. Margaret, using strength she didn't know she possessed, dragged the heavy man into the cramped but secure shelter of the coach. She had just laid him down when she heard more riders approaching. Fast, she peeked out again. 3 men, their figures hard silhouettes against the darkening sky. The man in the lead was Silas Croft. Her blood ran cold. They were hunting him. Croft and his men reined in their horses a short distance away, their eyes scanning the desolate landscape. "He came this way," one of the men said. "Horse is lamed. He can't have gotten far." Croft's gaze fell upon her camp, the pathetic wreck and the thin curl of smoke from her fire. He rode closer, his expression a mask of contempt. "You," he called out, "girl with the woodpile. You seen a man ride through here? Wounded?" Margaret stepped out of the coach, positioning herself to block the entrance. She kept her face impassive, her hands held loosely at her sides. "No one here but me and my dog," she said, her voice steady. Croft stared at her, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. He glanced at the single set of tracks leading to her camp, her own, and the exhausted horse Mercer had ridden, which had wandered off to graze. He seemed to accept her story, but his eyes lingered on the coach. "Strange place to call home," he sneered. Just then, the storm broke. A flash of lightning lit up the landscape, followed by an immediate, deafening crack of thunder. The first heavy drops of rain began to fall. Croft cursed, not wanting to be caught in the deluge. "Let's go," he barked at his men. "He'll wash up in a gully by morning." They wheeled their horses around and galloped away, disappearing into the growing storm. Margaret let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She had made her choice. She turned back to the wounded man in her care, the fate of the fort now resting squarely on her shoulders. The storm raged all night, a furious onslaught of wind and rain that tested every patch and repair Margaret had made to the coach. But the shelter held. Inside, by the flickering light of a single tallow candle, she tended to Boone Mercer. The arrow had gone clean through the fleshy part of his shoulder. Drawing on the practical knowledge she'd gained, tending to the cuts and burns of soldiers as a laundress, she broke off the shaft and carefully drew the head through. She cleaned the wound with whiskey from Boone's own canteen and packed it with a poultice of yarrow she had gathered, a trick the old Shoshone woman had shown her. He was delirious with fever for hours, muttering about renegades and ambushes, but by dawn the fever broke and the storm passed. When he finally opened his eyes, they were clear. He looked around the cramped space, at the makeshift roof, and then at her. "Where?" "You're safe," Margaret said simply, offering him a tin cup of water. He drank greedily. His eyes fell on the army satchel sitting beside her. He pushed himself up, wincing in pain. "The dispatches," he rasped. "Corporal Evans," Margaret handed him the satchel. He opened it and pulled out the blood-stained map. A shadow of grief passed over his face. "This was Charlie's," he said, his voice thick. "My partner. We knew something was wrong. The freight shipments from Croft Freight were too heavy, the manifests too light. He was a good man. He must have found the proof." Together, they pieced it all together. Boone, with his knowledge of the fort's operations and Croft's business dealings, and Margaret, with the physical evidence from the coach. Croft and a small group of associates were using their freight company as a cover to sell U.S. Army rifles and ammunition to a band of disgruntled outlaws, planning to incite a raid on the undermanned fort and then profit from the ensuing chaos and the lucrative rebuilding contracts. Corporal Evans had discovered their plan and the location of their hidden weapons cache, which he'd marked on the map. They had ambushed his mail coach to stop the warning from ever reaching Fort Laramie. "They thought they'd gotten away with it," Boone said, his hand tightening into a fist. "They didn't count on you." The journey to Fort Laramie was tense. Boone was still weak, but he could ride. Margaret rode the corporal's horse, the precious satchel tied securely to the saddle. As they rode through Redemption Creek, the townspeople who had once laughed at her now watched in silence. They saw the grim-faced scout, the determined woman, and the official army satchel. They didn't know the story, but they could see the purpose in her eyes. The laughter was gone, replaced by a new, uncertain respect. At Fort Laramie, the sentries were hesitant to let the dusty, disheveled pair see the commander. But Boone's name and the urgency in his voice got them through. The commander, a Colonel Davies, was a stern, by-the-book officer with tired eyes. He listened without interruption as Margaret and Boone laid out the story, presenting the dispatches and the blood-stained map. When they finished, he was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the map. He then sent a patrol to the location Corporal Evans had circled in the Antelope Hills. They returned hours later with Silas Croft and 2 of his men in irons, and confirmation of a massive, hidden cache of weapons. Colonel Davies stood before Margaret in his office. Croft's bluster was gone, replaced by a sullen, silent rage as he was led away. "Miss Voss," the colonel said, his voice calm and professional. "It is a rare thing to find a citizen with your courage and integrity. The United States Army is in your debt." The words, spoken with quiet sincerity, were a balm on the wounds of her unjust dismissal. Vindication was a quiet, solid thing, and it felt like coming home. The late afternoon sun cast a warm, golden light over the small plot of land by the creek. The wind, which had once seemed so menacing, now whispered gently through the cottonwood leaves. Margaret stood beside the coach. Her coach. It was no longer a wreck, a symbol of ruin. It was a home, a beginning. Boone Mercer stood with her, his arm now in a proper sling. The army had declared the coach and its contents salvage, and by right of discovery, they were hers. They had also given her a reward, a sum of money that felt impossibly large, paid from the fort's discretionary fund for vital intelligence. It was enough to buy this parcel of land outright from the county, to purchase a good, steady horse, and to ensure she would never again have to depend on the whims of others for her survival. The people of Redemption Creek treated her differently now. The whispers had turned from mockery to awe. Jed, the old liveryman, had come by that morning. He hadn't said much, but he had pressed a heavy, canvas-wrapped bundle into her hands. Inside was a set of old, but beautifully maintained carpentry tools, a handsaw, a block plane, chisels, a mallet. They were my father's, he'd mumbled. He would have wanted someone who knows what to do with them to have them. The gift was more precious to her than the reward money. Boone looked at her, his gaze soft. "What will you do now, Margaret?" he asked. "With all this?" He gestured to the land, the coach, the future stretching out before her. She looked at the coach, at the new, clean plank she had just fitted into the wall, the wood smooth and true under her hand. She thought of the splintered ruin she had dragged here, the broken pieces she had patiently collected and put back together. She had started with nothing but a wreck, and from it she had built a shelter, found a purpose, and uncovered a truth. She smiled, a small, quiet smile that reached her eyes. "I think," she said, her voice carrying the quiet confidence of a hard-won lesson, "I've learned how to mend what's broken." In the golden light, surrounded by the vast, quiet prairie, she was no longer the dismissed laundress. She was a builder. Thank you for watching with us to the very end. This has been a story about finding value where no one else can see it. If you were moved by Margaret's journey of resilience and quiet strength, please give this video a like and let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss our next story from the forgotten pages of history. We'll see you again soon.